welcome back to another video here guys, and in this video I have put together a paludarium for my little frog Tiddly. So that's right, I have put together a paludarium for my little frog Tiddly using this Get Your Pet Right tower. I have done a review video on these enclosures and I actually reckon they're a really good enclosure, so make sure you go and check out that video if you think you're in the market for a new kind of glass terrarium like this. But stick around, check out this video because this is a really cool build and I'm really stoked to have finally gotten Tiddly into here. So this is the Get Your Pet Right tall tower. The dimensions on this are 60 centimeters wide, 90 centimeters tall, and 45 centimeters deep front to back. Now, if you want to see more of this actual enclosure, I have done a review video on it, which I have done in the past that I'll link up above. I reckon it's a really cool enclosure. First thing I did was start taking everything apart and getting rid of the foam background. I'm not a particular fan of foam backgrounds and I like to make my own, and that's what I plan to do here. I started off this build by actually lying the enclosure down on its back. This will allow me to put spray foam in it without worrying about it sliding down and coming off the glass. The first thing I did was kind of play around with how I wanted my hardscape to be in there. I knew that I wanted quite a few branches to be able to poke out, so Tiddly, the magnificent tree frog's actually got somewhere to perch. Something else I did was actually include this little bit of aluminium tube down the corner here, and this is just to allow me to get kind of little pipes and things through the background itself without it being obstructed. You'll see how this kind of comes together later. So yeah, the bulk of this is actually just playing around with what I seem to like and seeing how it goes. Something else that I did was I actually put in a couple of little bits of PVC tube that are only a few centimeters long at the top. Again, you'll see what this is for later, but it's kind of part of a drip wall system that I had an idea for. I just put these into place using a little bit of gaffer tape, and all the gaffer tape and everything will be covered up later with expanding foam. And now it's on to the fun stuff, filling it up with expanding foam. For this build I used the Bostik expanding foam. You can get this from your local hardware store or Bunnings. That's what we have here in Australia, but most expanding foams will do the same sort of job. So again, it was really important to lay the enclosure down on its back so I'm not fighting gravity. If you were to do this with the enclosure standing up, a lot of the time the expanding foam will just slip down the enclosure and it'll just be a horrible mess in the bottom of it. This was the first time that I've actually used this method as far as using the expanding foam to actually anchor all the timber into place. I think in the past I've always wanted to be able to change enclosures up and move them around and such, but this was like a big enclosure that I decided that no, this is what I want. I want a really nice rainforest paludarium, and I was going to make this very permanent. So first and foremost, I made sure that I had enough foam around the actual timber pieces themselves. And then after that, I started working around the rest of the enclosure, just putting a nice solid layer down. Keep in mind that all of this is going to fluff up and expand up, so it's just a matter of time before you end up coming back and actually carving all of this out. So this is the first side after it's cured, and this kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what it's going to look like. It's a little bit hard to see, but a lot of these branches come quite far out into the enclosure and will allow different sites for Tiddly to be able to perch on. So keep in mind that where this is going to go inside of my home, I'm actually going to do two walls of this terrarium in this sort of style. So it kind of looks like a bit of a corner piece inside of my lounge room. So here you can see me using some gaffer tape as essentially like supports for bits of timber that I'm going to do on the other side of the enclosure. Now, this can just allow me to kind of hang pieces in a certain fashion and kind of get them into an orientation that I really enjoy. It's a little bit awkward, it's a little bit messy, but at the same time, this is a good way to be able to just kind of temporarily anchor things in before you get some foam into place and really kind of make it permanent. From there, it was a matter of just repeating the process that we did on the other side, so focusing foam around the actual timber pieces themselves, and then after that we can work on the actual back wall as such. So as I alluded to earlier, I am going to do a drip wall system in this. I wasn't 100% sure how this was going to work, but I had a pretty good idea in my mind. So I'm going to be using this little Aqua One pump, and I found a little attachment that seems to fit into here quite easily. A little bit of force puts it in, but that's going to make a nice tight water seal. Now from there, what I'm going to use is a little bit of hosing to essentially attach to the pump, and by using a little bit of boiling water I can just make this fit over this little nozzle here a little bit easier and get a nice tight seal. And as you can see, there's a little bit of power coming out of this little pump. So what I ended up doing after that is I actually went through with a thumbtack and poked a whole bunch of holes into this little tube here for the kind of section that I thought might be useful as a drip wall. I did have to go back over this at a later point and actually use a pair of tweezers to essentially make some slightly bigger holes, because I found that these little holes just didn't work so crash hot eventually. So I did go back through with a pair of tweezers, as I said, just to make some slightly bigger holes and make a bit more of an adjustment. Now I did plug up the end of the tube with a weird little kind of thumb screw thing I had kicking around in an old aquarium box of mine. I've got so much gear there that's just randomly hanging around. So after I had the kind of drip wall components made, I was going to start up with working on my rain system essentially. So this is actually going to be the reservoir container for my rainwater, and this is just essentially like a Tupperware container. You could use anything for this really, but I found this really nice clear one. I think it was at Woolies or Coles. But essentially all I'm going to do is drill a little hole in the top here to allow a hose that's going to draw water out of it to go into the container itself. It's important that if you're ever drilling holes in any plastic to make sure you go super slow. You don't want to force anything, because quite often you can end up cracking plastic if you do force anything. Now I found with the soft tubing that the actual hose itself would go in and then just kind of curl around the bottom of the container. So what I ended up doing is finding this bit of rigid RO line, and what I was going to do is essentially just use it as a bit of a guide piece to allow a hose to go through the hard tube itself to go down into the bottom of the reservoir, and then that way it could draw water up. It was important to put a bit of a 45-degree angle on the hose too, just to make sure it doesn't kind of try to suction against the bottom of the tank. So with this being done, it just means that you'll be able to draw right down to the bottom of the reservoir. So here I'm just giving you a bit of a visual as to how it's actually going to work. So essentially this little tube's just going to be, as I said, a rigid guide for this little soft tube to go down into the bottom of this reservoir, then it can just go down like this. That way we can suck right down to the bottom of it rather than having the tube curl up, and maybe I can only, draw water out of, let's say, 4/5 of the tank. So now it's on to the actual rain part itself, or the rain tubing as I like to refer to it as. This is just simple irrigation tube that you can get from Bunnings. So I use that, and usually I use a few T-pieces or angles or right angles as such. You can find all this stuff super cheap at Bunnings in the irrigation aisle. It's, a matter of dollars. It's really nothing. Depending on the kind of pump you use will depend on how much rain's actually going to come out of these. So in my circumstance, it just being a small little dosing pump from an aquarium, I only get kind of a few drip points. But what I like to do is I like to add in tons of holes, just in case there does end up being like any sorts of clogs or anything in any holes, and there's always a way for water to find its way out. I've very rarely had these actually get clogged as such, but it's always a possibility, and usually can be remedied with just a bit of a bath in some fresh water to get any sort of calcification out. I kind of marked out where I wanted this to go on the actual enclosure lid, and I kind of made a bit of a loop. From there it was just a matter of using a few small zip ties to anchor it into place. Now it's important to note that this goes on the inside of the terrarium, not on the outside of the lid. Otherwise you'll end up with rust marks and all sorts through your lid, and nobody wants that. I did make a little access hole for the actual water tube to come out of the top of the lid. So basically all you're using is that little T-piece to use as a bit of a junction just for the water to actually go in via a hose. So something a bit new for me is this little fogger. I've never used one of these foggers as such before, not like an actual reptile branded fogger. And I've kind of made my own in the past just using humidifiers and things that you can get off eBay. But the thing that I really liked about this is it obviously comes with a nice hose, and it fits the product perfectly. And it's a long hose. It's a kind of a long kinky hose like this, but you can stretch it out and kind of angle it how you want. I really do like that. Jerry's future terrariums are actually going to end up having a port that you can put these hoses into, but for now he doesn't have one on these older versions. So what I ended up doing was just putting a couple of little nicks inside of the tube here itself, and just using a couple of little zip ties to essentially just anchor it to the top of the mesh. It's a little bit of a kind of quick fix type thing, but it works. I didn't really want to put a giant hole inside of the terrarium top, so for now this is going to be it. Maybe down the line, once Jerry's got his new enclosures up and the new versions, if the lids still fit, maybe I could do a bit of a hot swap for the lid. Now, the reason that I wanted to add a fogger into this is not necessarily for the frog itself. It's more so just to provide a little bit of humidity to the plants, but it's also for a little bit of aesthetics. So now it's on with the background. After this has been all cured, it was time for me to carve it all up. So I just used a steak knife for this because I just find that nice and easy to be able to take chunks off in between using your fingers just to kind of rip and tear little bits off. There's certain parts where I kind of just roughed it up a little bit basic. I kind of just tried to take a little bit of the top off a few of the areas, but I didn't do the whole enclosure. You'll notice there that I just carved out a little bit of a section where you can almost see through the terrarium, and that's because that's where those PVC pipes lie. That's going to be a little bit of an area for me to actually feed that hose through for the drip wall. You'll see this all come together later. After I'd finished my carving, it was basically just time to tape everything up, all the plastic trims and things that could get damaged quite easily. The glass wasn't as important because you can kind of clean the glass up quite easily, but all those black plastic trims, if you get the tile pointing on it, it's just so hard to get off. And speaking of tile pointing, this is what we've got. We've got the Dunlop tile pointing. I believe this is the sandstone colour. I've always got a couple of buckets of this kicking around that I just tend to mix up with my own kind of concoctions of colours using oxides. So that's what you can see here is essentially I'm just getting a whole bunch of the tile pointing out that I'm going to be using. And from there I'm just going to mix in some oxides, a mixture of chocolate and jet black to kind of get a bit of a desired look. I use some water in the bucket as well just to kind of help it mix everything together. This also changes the consistency of the tile pointing from kind of like a semi-dry slop into something that's a little bit more easy to paint on. As we go with different coats and layers, we're going to thicken that up. The only thing that I found kind of annoying about putting this background together is I'm trying to just dodge all the wood. So obviously I didn't want to cover the wood in tile pointing, I wanted that to be kind of a bit of a feature. And that did make it a little bit harder to paint this compared to other terrariums and stuff that I've put together. Now I think it's important to note that quite often people will actually use silicone to bind on around the edges of a expanding foam background onto glass, and that's very important because quite often what can happen is the expanding foam can actually delaminate from the glass. But what I will actually say here is I didn't bother with silicone myself because the tile pointing is very adhesive to glass, so that was all I really wanted to do around the edges of the glass to help stick it into place. I let the enclosure completely cure up and air out for over 2 weeks over the Christmas break. I really didn't want to risk anything with this enclosure just because I have had some thoughts in the past that maybe part of the curing process, if you don't leave it long enough, maybe kind of fumes and stuff can come out of it. I'm not 100% sure on that, but There's entire possibilities. One thing I really wanted to make sure is I rinsed the heck out of this enclosure too, just in case there's any sorts of debris or anything that could be on the outside of it. So I really gave it a good thorough hosing outside and drained all of the tank out and everything, just to make sure that there was no possibilities of anything going wrong here. Here you can see how I can actually feed the tube through for the drip wall system, and that's all through that aluminium pipe in the corner. Now I'm going to place the pump right down in this far corner, so I can actually feed that tube straight up and through there. You'll see that this pump will actually end up essentially being a filter system for this whole tank soon. So feeding it through the pipes, this tube can go straight through here, straight into the pipes. Those pipes just act as a little bit of an anchor. You can see how it kind of fits into place there. So for the substrate of this enclosure, I actually decided to use some thick grade aquarium sponge. I ordered this off eBay. It was about $15-16 a sheet, and I didn't end up using all of it, but I ordered a little bit too much just in case I actually needed it. My theory was to essentially cut this to size around the aquarium pump in the corner, and allowing a couple of little pieces of sponge that I can actually lift up should I need to replace the pump. My plan is to essentially have a pond in the front left-hand corner that Titterlet can actually enjoy, but as well as having a lot of land area that the frog can actually go and hop around on. I shaped the foam using a variety of scissors, razor blades, and a few other bits and pieces. This is a good way to be able to get a kind of a natural scape in there, and it also acts as a filter. So next was the fun part. This was actually testing out all of the equipment inside of this terrarium. First we started off with the drip wall to see how it would actually flow. We can actually end up changing the direction of flow of this water as well, using different things like mosses on the back wall. This is something that I'll actually show you a little bit later. I also tested out the fog system to see how long I wanted it to come on for and at what intensity. I've got this programmed to come on a few times a day, but generally in the morning and the evening, just for about a minute at a time. Not too much. So now it was time to plant out this terrarium, and using this little bit of garden wire, I was cutting small lengths of it and then essentially bending these small lengths into some little U-shapes, almost like little staples. My plan was to essentially use these little staples, as we'll call them, to pin these plants into place against the back wall, puncturing through the tile pointing itself. The main lot of plants that I used for this build were predominantly different types of philodendrons, some pothos and some monstera. I wanted to start these off nice and low inside of this terrarium so they could grow up the back wall in time, in a bit of a natural pattern. And as they go, they'll either adhere themselves to the back wall, or I'll staple them into place. Some of the plants were new, but a lot of them were actually already in Titterlet's tank, or I'd had them as cuttings from other plants around the house. It's one thing about building things like this is you can't expect instant results. While these plants look like they are all very juvenile, essentially down low inside of the terrarium, they will grow in over time, and eventually this whole thing is just going to be a bit of a lush rainforest. That's the plan anyway. I visited my in-laws a little while ago and managed to collect a whole bunch of moss from around their garden, as well as a few other little plant cuttings. Now these have been growing inside of a tub, just with a bit of decent light above it and a bit of humidity for quite a while inside of one of my spare bedrooms. That was what I was going to use essentially for the forest floor, if you want to call it that. This might go through a little bit of a shock process and stuff, but eventually it'll take off inside of here. There's no real method to my madness as such. It's basically just a case of placing the moss where I think it's going to suit and where it's going to live. I should add that the main light that I use above this terrarium is actually a Aqua Illumination Freshwater Prime HD. So they're an aquarium based light, but they're made for planted aquariums. They're a very controllable light where you can actually choose the individual LED spectrums and stuff per chip, and you can actually dial it into different sunrise, sunset features and all sorts. This is going to be plenty for these kind of bit more low light, rainforesty type plants. I really enjoy how this mist just kind of rolls down in amongst these plants and out over this little bit of a water pond. I reckon it just looks unreal. So the rain dripper system is now in place, and the reservoir itself, you can see obviously I'm just filling it up with water here. This is dechlorinated tap water, and this is just located in the cupboard underneath the actual terrarium itself. I connected the hose to actually feed the dripper loop on top of the terrarium there, and we're going to connect this up to a little simple aquarium doser. It's a John Len dosing pump. It's very common here in Australia. They're a very basic pump, and basically I set this up to drop about 25 ml of water every couple of hours. So it's just a light sprinkle. It's not a hell of a lot, but this is enough to do a couple of things. It can kind of just keep the plants nice and humid. The other thing that it can actually do too is make sure that any of the evaporation inside of the actual paludarium part of the tank is actually topped up as well. So I'm kind of just fine tuning it as per the seasons go, but essentially what this will do is just allow me to not have to really fill up the tank anymore. So as I mentioned earlier, I am using a Grid Connect power board for this. I do really rate these power boards. They're a great little investment. Sometimes they have a few glitches with the little button that's on them, but Bunnings are pretty good about replacing power boards on the spot. But as you can see here, this is the rain system working. It's a very light sprinkle. It's nothing intense. It's not like a Mist King system or anything like that. So with these little sprinkles and the fogger, that's more than enough. Here you can have a look at a deep heat projector that I've actually got on top of this as well. This is over one of the main basking logs, and it's controlled by a thermostat. One of the most exciting things for me is actually using this new LED UVB bar from Get Your Pet Right. This is the first time that I've actually been using one of these personally at home. I have seen them and been watching these be developed for years now, and it's really cool to actually own my first one. It's crazy to think that these things can produce UVB that's usable for over 4 years. Not all of these chips are going to produce a visual light that us as humans can actually see, but a lot of them are visual, different types of UV light that the actual animals themselves can see. It's a very nice and sleek unit, and this is going to provide a little bit more natural light to the terrarium for a number of hours a day. I've got this programmed to come on for 5 hours a day for this frog, which that should be more than enough. I managed to get my hands on a large amount of Java moss that was a little bit worse for wear. Nonetheless, I've been able to kind of strap this onto a lot of the timber branches using a bit of that garden wire just wrapped around the branches and around the moss, and this will eventually grow in across all of these branches and give a really nice effect to the enclosure. This plant has already taken off so quickly in the back corner, and it's already covering up the cord from the pump. Here you can see that I've actually shoved a whole bunch of that Java moss in around where that pipe comes in for the dripper system. And that's just going to hide that up, and eventually all of this Java moss will start growing down the back wall. All in all, I've been pretty impressed with how this enclosure's come together. Potentially in the future I might add in another few fine kind of plants, like just different things. I'd like to get my hands on some Agravia, maybe some Peperomia, just stuff like that. Tiddalik seems to be loving a new enclosure as well.
So guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I can't wait to see this terrarium grow in even further. It's already been doing so. Like, it's been a few weeks since Tiddly's actually been in there now, and the plants are, for the most part, going pretty well. As you can see, I've got a whole bunch of that Java moss in there as well, which is going through a bit of a transitional phase. That's okay. It's all part of the fun, really. You can see Tiddles just crawling around the background there. She likes to come out this time of night and kind of get right back up into that corner. There's kind of like a little divot up there that she likes to sit in. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. If you do want to support the channel even further, make sure to drop me a comment below. Give me a like on the video as well. And if you want to, subscribe to the channel for more reptile related content. If you do want to go that next step further, you can go and check out Teespring, get yourself some merchandise, or you can even check out Patreon, where you can get some early access videos as well as some Patreon only videos as well. Alrighty guys, until the next one, take it easy and I'll catch you then.